Now then, Guy de la Bedoyere is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in London. Guy, you're very welcome to the programme today. You've written a fantastic and really timely article, I think, which I read this week. I was sent it by a viewer, actually. Welcome to the programme.
Good morning, Peter.
I'm really fascinated by what you were saying about the nature of technology, the nature of the systems. We're talking about the Post Office scandal this week and the fact that so many people were told, as you point out in your article and as we've been talking about so much, we're basically told, well, the system says this, therefore it's right. Horizon cannot be argued with, even though there are so many problems. But this points to a big and wider debate in terms of how technology interacts with us and how the system dictates to us how we live our lives. Just for those who haven't had the benefit of reading your article, and I highly recommend they read it, maybe you could just explain your thesis on this.
Well, I'm fascinated by the whole context of time, Peter. I mean, we live in our particular age. It's extremely easy to see and think of everything around us and take it for granted. But let's just put it into context. There's 5,000 years only of recorded history, and that's a tiny fraction of human existence, most of which is, you know, just living with things like this, a stone tool. So that's 5,000 years, and out of that 5,000 years, 3,500 of them are what we call the ancient world, and there are technological developments there, like, for example, the smelting of metals, improvement in ships, that kind of thing, but not actually very much. It's all quite slow. After that, you've got 1,000 years of the Middle Ages. And only then do you come down to the 500 years that leads up to our own time. And even within that, most of the technological development that we're talking about that completely rules our lives belongs to only the last 250 years. And even within that, a huge amount of it is incredibly recent. I'm just going to show you one thing. Just be aware that some people are listening on the radio as well as watching on TV, so maybe just describe what you're about to hold up as well, Guy, if you don't mind. Right, what I'm holding up now is my wristwatch. It's a US Army Air Force wristwatch, and it was made in 1945, and it still works. It's completely possible for a single human being to get their brain around how that works. It's full of whirling cogs and springs, and I'm sure some of your viewers and listeners will remember having watches like that. I simply wind it up every day. But we have jumped in the time since something like that was an everyday piece of equipment to being surrounded by all this electronic stuff, which is totally beyond any one of us as an individual to fully understand. It's even impossible for a single person to make or maintain it. I spent a number of years teaching in a high school, and I was fascinated by how the students doing A-level physics weren't even taught to wire up a plug. They didn't learn anything about AC, which is what rules our world. Yet we were surrounded by all this stuff. And then, of course, you jump onto the Post Office scandal. No one in the entire tier, from the bottom of the Post Office up to the top, right to the leadership of the Post Office, down to a sub-postmaster, none of them involved in this scandal were capable of understanding any of that equipment, which meant that the sub-postmasters were not capable, not able, not trained to be able to see inside to find out what was going wrong with that. And everything was being enforced by a whole hierarchy of officials, not one of whom, as far as I could see, had the wherewithal to think critically about it and think, as you would have imagined, wouldn't you, a right-minded person would say, hang on, this is totally implausible.
But why is that? Why do people, Guy, why do they suspend their critical faculties when it comes to big technological things they don't understand, when they simply say, oh, well, the system says this, therefore it must be right?
I think this is a phenomenon absolutely none of us have got our heads around. I come back to what I said earlier. This is all so recent, we simply don't know what to do with it. And you know, I quoted Carl Sagan, actually, in the article, and I'll read this out for you because I think it absolutely sums it up. We've arranged a global civilization in which the most crucial elements profoundly depend on science and technology. We have also arranged things so that almost no one understands science and technology. This is a prescription for disaster. We might get away with it for a while, but sooner or later, this combustible mixture of ignorance and power is going to blow up in our faces. Well, it's blown up in the Post Office's face, and I suppose the tenet of my article really was to suggest there's an awful lot of potential for things like this to happen elsewhere, everywhere in the future if we carry on down this route.
It is terrifying. And as you say, the combustible nature of this, the fact that there is, and we're moving into an age of AI, we're moving into an age where we understand even less of what's going on. Horizon is a sophisticated system that didn't work, and was you know, there were many engineers who apparently were putting in absolute nonsense numbers to try to fix it, to interfere with what was going on. That technology, or some of that technology that we're talking about and dealing with, is 25 years old, from 1999, yes. The first iteration of Horizon. Things have moved on hugely since then. Has there been an improvement? Do you think there's more reliability, or has it just got so complex that we don't know whether it's reliable or not?
It has got much more complicated. And I found myself, when I worked for the BBC, which was back in the 80s and 90s, that when it went from analog systems to digital, what was self-evidently apparent straight away is that the new digital systems were often not compatible with one another. And then when it was upgraded, it didn't work with a previous version. And if you take that probe that was supposed to land on the moon a few days ago, and it all went completely wrong, yet you know, over half a century as a boy, half a century ago as a boy, I was watching the television when people landed on the moon. Let me take you back almost 300 years to a ship called the Zeewick, which was a shipwreck off the west coast of Australia in 1727. Now, that ship was wrecked, but the survivors built a new ship out of the wreckage and sailed all the way up the west coast of Australia to Batavia, and most of them survived. An absolutely incredible story, but it shows you that in those days, that level of technology, you could control it, you could manipulate it, you could remake it, you could understand it. All this stuff that we have around us today, it's just a pile of wires and circuitry that does absolutely brilliant things. And I'm an author. I use computers the whole time. I'm totally dependent on it. But if it goes wrong, there is practically nothing I can do about it, and I can't repair the software. And, you know, the whole thing is hanging on a thread of electricity. Those people I just described, those Dutch sailors off the west coast of Australia, they weren't dependent on any electricity. I mean, there's an aerial photograph of my village taken during 1944. It's just outside Grantham in Lincolnshire, and I can see my house on it. Now, I know that this village in 1944 had no running water, no main sewer, no electricity, but people lived and survived. And all of this stuff that we are made ourselves totally dependent on is, in grand historical terms, only in the last 5 minutes. And we just don't know where we are with it.
What do we do about it? Because we're moving into more system. I mentioned AI there, but also things like digital currency. We have in China, we have things like social credit systems where so many things are different monitored. The whole idea of metadata, data about data. There's so much that we can't quite get our head around, even if we are futurists, technologists, whatever, or even historians, as I know you are, and I sort of slightly was a little bit. I have a history degree. But, I mean, it's interesting in terms of what we do about it, because there is so little agency for the common man or woman. We've seen so much in this post office scandal that has been the case. But even in so many other examples, there's so many situations where, I mean, very, very small and not particularly important example. But one thing I had this week, for example, HMRC told me I owed them told me I owed them £200. I paid the £200. A few days later, £200 came back, because I actually didn't owe it to them. But the system said it did, and I had no option but to pay that. And they would have pursued me through the courts for that money before realising their error. And I'm sure there are lots of ideas, there are lots of times when people simply receive letters like that, or emails, saying, you have to pay this money because the system says you have to pay this money. You've no way of saying, well, why? What is the calculation? Where's the evidence of this? As was the case in Horizon.
Oh, Peter, I could give you so many examples. You pronounced my name at the beginning. It's for those who don't know it, it's a French surname. It's 3 words. So what? That never used to be a problem until computers came along when I book flights. You see, the airline system compresses it to 1 word.
Yes.
And then, of course, when I stick my passport in the machine at Heathrow, it says, no booking found, because it says the name is incompatible with the name on the booking, which the name on the passport is incompatible. So then you have to go and find a human being to interact to change that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to get on the flight. And there's another example I would cite, which I think it may sound a bit banal, but I think it symbolises. If you're driving down a motorway and you see a family by the side of the road and they've got a puncture, Now, of course, 9 times out of 10 today, they're going to be in a car with no spare wheel.
Yes.
There's not only is there no spare wheel, they have been, they won't even know how to change the wheel. They will have been infantilized from it. And so actually, it's not just the induction of the technology, but in fact, there is a whole level of infantilization which is trickling down through our society, in which all sorts of basic tasks that you or I would have taken for granted once are being removed from us. It's either being done by a machine or we're being prevented actually from interacting with it. And that's a whole additional complication. You see, I showed you there, right? That's what I to describe to people who can't hear it. There's a stone tool from the old Stone Age, and that was about the limit of the technology that was in those days. You could just make it. If it broke, you could just repair it. And that ability extends right the way into early modern times.
And that's exactly what a number of our viewers and listeners are getting in touch about. Vic simply says, this guy knows what he's talking about. Dan and Kent says, I'm not a mechanic, Cardi P, but back in the 1980s when the car broke down, I'd have a rough idea. Technology in cars now, forget it.
Yes.
Guy is spot on. As a society, technology has overtaken and disappeared into the sunset. Absolutely fascinating discussion, Guy. Thank you very much indeed
Not at all, my pleasure.
That's Guy de la Bedoyere, who's a fellow at the Society of Antiquaries in London.